Greg Caprellis, manager with Mandiant Intelligence, now part of Google Cloud. And today we'll be talking about supply chain compromise attacks. I'm really excited to be joined by Stephen Eccles. Stephen is a reverse engineer in our labs division and was actually one of the first people to analyze the Sunburst malware and the SolarWinds breach. Stephen, please say hi.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Greg. Happy to be here.
So we'll kick things off taking a look at an introduction to supply chain compromise attacks. Next, we'll take a closer look at some of the recent trends that we've identified here at Mandiant Intelligence. Then Stephen will give us his firsthand insight into the SolarWinds incident. Finally, we'll conclude with sharing some defensive recommendations and additional helpful resources because it's not all bad news. Supply chain compromise threats are really one of the most dangerous types of TTPs that we track here at Mandiant, but fortunately, they're also one of the rarest. As you can see here in 2021, we only saw 31 incidents of supply chain compromise attacks, with the vast majority of those being attributed to China. There are, however, two important caveats to note. First, although we only saw 31 total attacks in 2021, that's a 48% increase from 2020 and more attacks than any other year on record. Second, although supply chain compromise attacks are quite rare, they have the potential to be extraordinarily dangerous. But really, what constitutes a supply chain compromise attack? So, from a technical perspective, supply chain compromise attacks are really a subset of a broader category of attacks deemed third party compromise. And third party compromise attacks are really any sort of attack in which the attacker abuses some sort of third party trusted relationship to compromise their intended victim. So, supply chain compromises are a specialized kind of third party threat. And we define supply chain compromise specifically as any situation in which an attacker gains unauthorized access to legitimate infrastructure or tools, and from there implants malicious code or components to be delivered by the legitimate vendor or repository via that same trusted distribution method that a user would typically leverage to obtain the legitimate device, program, package, or update. So, really, service for that matter. Supply chain compromise is particularly dangerous because it really abuses not just the trust between businesses and people, but specifically it abuses the inherent trust that users really place in the products they purchase. For large enterprise organizations, this inherent trust relationship can exist in suppliers of hardware, software, and the updates that most software programs rely on. For some organizations, a supply chain compromise attack may even abuse trust that they may not even realize they're placing in a service, such as GitHub or other collaborative code sharing communities for that matter. So many projects in large tech-centered organizations today rely on a vast array of tools, packages, and solutions sourced from a wide array of open source repositories that even identifying them all is extremely difficult. Supply chain compromise attacks are rare, but they provide bad actors with two great advantages. First, they're extremely difficult to detect. They're so difficult, in fact, that we are fairly certain at Mandiant that many attacks likely go undetected every year. And even those that are detected may not be reported, as some organizations likely avoid public disclosure. Second, supply chain compromise attacks allow actors to compromise victims at vast scale. As we'll discuss shortly, the SolarWinds compromise was so dangerous in part because it allowed the actors behind it to choose their victims from a pool of nearly 18,000 organizations. And this really afforded these malicious, sophisticated actors extreme level of access at scale, which is a recipe for disaster. For the first time in 2021, Mandiant identified more supply chain compromises involving developer tools or software dependencies than compromises affecting final software products. These incidents frequently involved resources from open source or collaborative communities, such as libraries and other code packages from the Python package index, also known as PyPy, or Node Package Manager, or NPM, Docker virtualization images, and even WordPress plugins and themes. So these threat actors have then leveraged this access to do nefarious things such as deploying coin miners or even ransomware. And Mandiant has identified incidents involving a financially motivated actor that we track as UNC3379, where they've targeted popular NPM packages to distribute malicious code and the Danabot backdoor. Abuse of open source repositories has not only been limited to financial motive, we've even seen a handful of examples in which actors abused open source repositories to spread protest messages, for example. In March of this year, the developer of the NPM Node IPC JavaScript library intentionally introduced malicious functionality in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And in this case, this update would actually check to see if the host machine was located in either Russia or Belarus. And if so, it would overwrite or wipe data. So you have a destructive attack and display a message calling for world peace. Subsequently released versions removed that destructive functionality, but still distributed text files containing anti war statements. So a bit of an information operation angle there as well. So, taking a look at the statistics between financially motivated cyber crime or cyber espionage nation state backed supply chain compromise threats, we have found that most state sponsored supply chain compromises identified in 2021 were linked to China. We also observed evidence of potential North Korean and Turkish incidents, for that matter. Chinese threat groups implanted malicious code into government software, including a biometric fingerprint scanning program leveraged by a South Asian government and the Mongolian Certificate Authority, MONPAS, likely to support intelligence collection efforts in those countries. Also, a Trojanized Chrome browser update was likely leveraged and distributed in China to support domestic monitoring, as well as censorship programming that was installed on devices manufactured in China, likely reflecting that internal collection mission. Since 2020, Mandiant has also observed an increase in financially motivated actors targeting the supply chain, notably actors associated with prior ransomware deployment. And we saw this tactic leveraged to deliver cryptocurrency miners and banking Trojans. We also noted reports of tainted packages and mobile applications used to facilitate cryptocurrency theft and mining, ad fraud, and even enrolling users in premium service subscriptions. In one really interesting case, we identified a malicious actor had actually Trojanized an installer for a closed circuit television software hosted on a legitimate website in May of last year, 2021. And upon installing this software, a chain of downloads and scripts essentially executed, which ultimately led to malware installation on the victim's computers. And we attributed this activity to an activity cluster known to conduct ransomware and data theft extortion operations. In two separate incidents in October and November of 2021, we identified threat actors had inserted into several popular NPM packages malicious code that would then lead to distribution of malware, including coin miners and Danabot instances associated with a botnet. In one particular package, in this case, uaparser.js, was reportedly downloaded 6 to 7 million times a week and leveraged by many high profile organizations. And this actually prompted the US Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, to issue an alert about this particular compromise. So we've covered supply chain attacks generally so far, but now let's take a closer look at one, if not the most infamous supply chain compromises, and what really amounted to be a watershed moment in information security, for that matter, the SolarWinds compromise. So, Stephen, what was it like when you first started to really hear about the SolarWinds compromise and the breach?
Yeah, so I think the easiest way to go through this is really let's just flash right back to December 8th. You're browsing around Twitter, trying to find the latest InfoSec news, and then boom, just headline after headline after headline about FireEye being hacked. That was really my first introduction to all of this public reporting. Later on, pretty much immediately after all of this, I was read into our internal incident. And then 3 days later, by December 11th, we had actually found the back door and then enabled its kill switch to inoculate all the victims around the world from this malware. So I don't know about you, but before all these headlines really started breaking, I had no idea what SolarWinds was or what they did at all. Now, obviously, I know. Essentially, SolarWinds is a company that specializes in network monitoring tools, and they have a particularly popular application called the Network Performance Monitor. So they're a vendor of network monitoring software. But looking at it more closely, they don't just make network monitoring software, they make extremely complicated enterprise level network monitoring software. For example, the offline installer from their website is about 4 gigabytes when compressed and over 14 gigabytes when fully installed. In total, there's about 200 or so executable files and over 3,000 DLLs. And we had to search through all of this. So I can tell you that as an RE, this is just an absolutely enormous amount of data to make sense through and understand. So it was a bit overwhelming, to say the least, at first.
Yeah, it really sounds like it. That's phenomenal insight. So on its face value, this appeared to be a breach with really wide-reaching impact. Can you talk a little bit more about the process of identifying how widespread that impact actually was?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like you're saying, one of the most interesting things about this was just the scale of it, and not just the scale, but also how they did their targeting. The number of potential victims in this incident was just absolutely massive. SolarWinds has over 33,000 customers, and over 18,000 had this actual Trojanized version of their appliance installed. And these customers, they spanned multiple verticals. We're talking government entities, consulting firms, banking, etc. Multiple verticals. And the actor, who's now officially been designated as APT 29, which is Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, they took care when designing their operation. We have evidence that they actually tested their ability to backdoor these SolarWinds updates before they had inserted any malicious code, kind of just to like test if inserting any code at all would raise alarms. And once they were sure that it wouldn't, is when they actually inserted their payload. And then we realized that the backdoor that they had inserted, Sunburst, it actually contained a fairly stealthy DNS-based C2 communication scheme that would actually exfiltrate information about the target organization name, other things like which antivirus products they had installed, and even the current time of the infection. And then based on this call out, the actor would actually determine if a victim was interesting or not in order to continue on with further exploitation.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So once you started to really understand the scale that you mentioned, right? What was it that really started, what set off that next set of alarm bells for you?
Yeah, so once we understood that there actually was, in fact, malicious code within the SolarWinds appliance, we tried to figure out how it got there. The most shocking thing for us immediately was the fact that the binary that we had actually found this code in was digitally signed, and it had a valid signature from SolarWinds. We were trying to explore ways that this could make sense outside of a supply chain attack, because it's fairly rare that you see something with a valid digital signature like this. And just based on the size of this, their customer base, it was really alarming to us that this potentially could be a supply chain attack. So we were looking at all avenues. Eventually, we did actually find the update bundle that was delivered to us by SolarWinds, and we were able to confirm that it was in fact a supply chain attack and that this was delivered to us from their servers. So that in and of itself was crazy enough for us to actually realize that this was in fact a massive, huge, wide-scale supply chain attack. But actually looking at the malware and how it was designed to operate is really what caught my attention, at least. In order to call out, like I was saying earlier, they used this DNS-based communication scheme to choose their victims. And it was clear that for some victims, they would actually upgrade them to what we call the second stage C2 communication scheme. But for others, they would actually not, and they would have the backdoor keep beaconing out or maybe even disable it entirely. So it's pretty clear that the malware was designed for very specific targeting, which is different from other malware, which might be more opportunistic and just trying to get any victim that they could. We also later figured out that this second stage C2 communication scheme, if these victims were upgraded to it, it wasn't just basic TCP or HTTP communications or anything like that. It actually attempted to blend in with another protocol of this appliance called OIP, which stands for the Orion Improvement Program. And this protocol is a built-in protocol where they send like usage statistics of the appliance back to their servers for enterprise level things. So the actual command and control scheme of this attacker interfacing with this backdoor, they actually would send commands that looked like OIP traffic. So if you were doing any kind of network analysis or had network monitoring tools, it was pretty clear that they were attempting to blend in order to further not raise any suspicions. So it was pretty clear to us that the attacker took evasion very, very seriously. And even in their targeting of victims, even though they had such a wide pool, it was clear that they were really focused on their operational objectives rather than, say, ransomware everyone that they had access to, which was quite interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, it really sounds like it. Absolutely. So you mentioned the DNS based C2 communications and a kill switch a bit. Can you speak to that a bit more?
Yeah. So essentially, as soon as we understood that there was this DNS communication protocol that was controlling if certain victims were upgraded to this second stage follow-on activity mode or not, if they weren't an interesting target, we really started analyzing that. And then once we analyzed that a bit, we realized that there was an operating mode that effectively acted like a kill switch, which fully disabled the malware. And the way that this worked was we determined that the attacker had control of DNS infrastructure, and they would make callouts to a particular domain, subdomains of avsvmcloud.com, and those subdomains are what encoded the organization name. If the backdoor got a response, or rather a resolution of a particular IP range, so if avsvmcloud.com resolved to a particular IP range, then it would do that transition into this disabled mode. So what we did is, once we understood this process and all the operational modes of the malware, we contacted GoDaddy, who was the registrar for avsvmcloud.com. And after proving to them that our intentions were good, we actually worked with them to rewrite the record for that avsvmcloud.com to the IP range that would disable the malware. Now, that IP range was actually owned by Microsoft, so we also had to work with Microsoft for this. After getting approval from GoDaddy and Microsoft, we were able to rewrite those records so that any malware that was resolving any subdomain of avsvmcloud.com would respond with this special range owned by Microsoft that would actually kill the backdoor. And we did that the same day that we actually wrote our public report and released this all to the world. So by the time we were live, all the victims around the world were actually inoculated against this backdoor.
Yeah, that's great. You have to love when you can sort of foil some of the fun there for the threat actors, right? With something like that. So that's great. Um, so when you finally dug in a bit more, right? When did you and what did you really start to understand about how the malware actually functioned, and really what was the ultimate mission complete, the aim for the attack?
Yeah, so this malware was written in .NET, and typically in .NET malware, the way that actors try to subvert reverse engineering is they employ things called packers, which basically encrypt or encode the code so that it's not immediately visible. Or they do things like rename variables with really long, bogus names that make no sense. Or they might unpack the code at runtime, so it's hidden in some area you can't see, and then they load it in memory and then execute it there. Rather than removing or hiding any information, this malware actually was designed a bit different. Sunburst tries to blend in to the Orion platform and appear legitimate. So it didn't use these more common obfuscation schemes. Instead, it did things like using programming specific or application specific terms when it named its variables and methods. Rather than random names, it would use names that plausibly made sense in that location. An example of this would be the malicious class that actually contained all of this malicious logic was called the Orion Improvement Business Layer. Now, This sounds like a legitimate SolarWinds term, but it's actually a combination of two different terms: Orion Improvement and Business Layer. Individually, these terms make sense in the context of the Orion software, but together they're a nonsensical thing. The reason why they might have done this is uh, if they're inserting a class, they want to appear to follow the same naming scheme, even if that naming scheme on close inspection doesn't make any sense. Additionally, when the backdoor performed any kind of malicious activity, it leveraged programming specific terms that made sense in that context. So an example of this is the DNS state machine that we've been talking about that controls the operating mode of the malware. It did a lot of network related parsing and logic in it. In fact, its running modes were actually named after an enumeration that describes different network types, such as NetBIOS, ATM, ImpLink. These are legitimate programming terms that refer to different network types. Uh, the malware actually repurposed these names, NetBIOS, ATM, ImpLink, to describe its running modes. An example would be NetBIOS would be currently running, ATM would be activated for second stage C2, and ImpLink might be fully disabled. So it reused terms in the context of what logic it was doing that would make sense, but actually had a dual meaning. And as at a quick glance, this might be interpreted as the malware actually doing these legitimate network operations, but in reality, they're obfuscating the legitimate malicious code. This was actually a shockingly tricky technique because they didn't use it everywhere. In some cases, variables were named after their true name. In some cases, they were using these made up or plausible names in other locations. So it really required us as REs to make sure that we didn't come in with any preconceived notions of what this was doing and actually verify and triple, double, quadruple check that we understood the logic as it was. One other example of novelty displayed by Sunburst was actually the structure of its code in and of itself. As I was saying earlier, most .NET malware uses in-your-face obfuscation, things like obfuscating the control flow, which is things like if statements and switches and loops, or it would use opaque predicates or control flow flattening or anti-debugging, or things that are obvious to see that they're being used, but hard to get through. Sunburst didn't do this. They really focused on stealth above all else, as we've been saying. In many cases, what they did to hide their logic while still looking plausible to be legitimate code was they would do things like add unnecessary loops around very simple statements like assignments, or create needless wrapper functions multiple levels deep around simple routines like sleep, with like if statements that would guard the length of the sleep, and confusing things like this. So what it does is it makes this malicious code look legitimate at a first glance. It looks like it might have been written by a SolarWinds engineer. Ultimately, it seems to me, at least, that Sunburst obfuscation was not aimed at hiding functionality from a trained malware analyst, and more so a developer or a code reviewer who might accidentally stumble upon this inserted backdoor code as part of like testing or routine code review. So really, in total, Sunburst wants to look like a legitimate part of the Orion code, and it seems like they were willing to forgo more common obfuscation techniques that might stand out and get them caught before their operation even began.
Yeah, that's fascinating, right? And of course, one of the hallmarks of extremely sophisticated nation state backed actors is that operational security, right? The stealthiness. So, and probably top of mind is an actor like APT 2029, right? Which now we know, of course, is the actor behind SolarWinds compromise, like you mentioned, right? Us having Mandiant having graduated UNC 2452, right, is initially reporting on being behind this to now we know it's APT 29, right? So, having said that, can you tell us a bit more about specifically some of the characteristics around the malware and some of the tactics, techniques, and procedures?
I sure can. First, let's cover the malware, which is really my spot. So first, there was the Sunspot malware. This was the malware that was actually inserted into SolarWinds build environment. And what it would do is it would monitor processes on the build servers, and then it would constantly check in a loop if the SolarWinds Orion source code was being compiled or not. If it found that it was being compiled, what it would do is it would swap one of the legitimate source files on disk for a copy of the same code that was actually Trojanized to include the backdoor source code. The backdoor source code that was inserted by Sunspot was actually what we call Sunburst, which is the primary implant and what we discovered that kind of led to the unraveling of this whole thing. Now, this is the primary implant. It accepts multiple commands for follow-on activity if the target is deemed interesting or not, based on those DNS callouts that exfiltrate the organization name. And some of that follow-on activity, if they were upgraded to this second stage, you're an interesting target mode, let's call it, was deploying things like teardrop or raindrop, which were basically custom droppers or launchers for the off-the-shelf Cobalt Strike. These tools were then leveraged to pivot around the environment and steal legitimate credentials, which was a very recurring theme for this actor. They really liked to gain legitimate credentials and then use those going forward. And then they used other neat techniques in their follow-on activities, such as they would replace legitimate Windows files, but they would do it temporarily. So an example of that might be totally random process name. Let's say calc.exe. If they had a malware that they wanted to execute on the victim machine, they would replace calc.exe with whatever their malware file was. They would execute that process. And then as soon as they were done, they would restore the original calc.exe. And you might be thinking, why bother with that? And the reason is a lot of endpoint EDRs or other tools like this, they create logs of activity that has happened, and they might log the process name, but they're probably not, in some cases, going to log the hash of the image. So if you, as an incident responder, come back later and you see calc.exe is doing malicious things, let's go see what that file is. You might go back to the machine and you're going to pull the legitimate calc.exe. And you're going to be wondering, how is this binary the result of that activity? And the answer is it's not. You would have to actually compare the image hashes to realize that the actual process that executed was not that calc.exe. And they did other things too. They would match the host names of their machines to whatever naming scheme was typical for that environment to sort of blend in, again, for logging purposes and things like that. As I mentioned earlier, they employed steganography to blend into legitimate protocols that already existed, such as the Orion Improvement Program, OIP, for their second stage C2 commands. And then they would also match their last hop IP address to whatever victim country they were targeting to sort of like avoid geolocation kind of checks. So
Yeah.
really interesting techniques here.
Yeah, very interesting, right? In terms of the techniques in the OPSEC. And you know what's interesting, oftentimes when we're looking at threat activity, right, we can sort of work backwards towards who's behind this, the attribution question, right, which is usually top of mind. You know, who's behind this and what are their goals by looking at what are they actually going after, right, in terms of the data, et cetera, that mission complete. So as you're looking at this, did you start to get some hints around, you know, what are they going after, who could be behind this, right, from a motivation standpoint?
Absolutely. So this was obviously a large Mandiant effort, but what we ended up finding was that they seemed to target internal documents and things like email, intellectual property of the company early on in their access to sort of like establish a foothold. They would target internal security documents and even particular security team members that might help them gain a larger foothold. But it was clear that they also avoided some data, such as personally identifiable information or financial data. And they also didn't appear to be destructive. They didn't ransomware every victim, which they could have, which would be a great way to make money off of this operation. So it was clear that they weren't financially motivated. So what the conclusion that we basically came to was this was classic espionage, and it was clear that the actor actually showed massive restraint in their targeting, even though they had such a massively wide pool of potential victims for access.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's truly fascinating. So, Stephen, thanks so much for walking us through this story and really sharing your firsthand account.
Of course, thanks so much for having me.
Okay, so it's not all bad news, right? So, what are some of the takeaways here, right? We can leverage to improve our security posture and our outcomes, right? Turning that intelligence that Stephen just did a great job of walking us through into action, right? So, first and foremost, the discovery of the SolarWinds incident in late 2020 really resulted in a lot of increased attention around supply chain compromise. We had government authorities and technology organizations really responding with several initiatives, legislation, and even studies really seeking to reduce software supply chain and software dependency risk. These initiatives might actually make it more difficult for threat actors to conduct these types of operations in the future. But organizations should also take steps to help mitigate risks around the supply chain threats to their organizations. So, for example, Mandiant suggests that organizations contemplate applying multiple layers of security policies, plans, and solutions to maximize opportunities to prevent and detect an anomaly or compromise around the supply chain threat. Some recommendations include establishing a vendor vetting process to help evaluate vendor security practices prior to actually deploying hardware or software within enterprise environments, etc. Establishing a change control process and a board for all enterprise hardware and software changes, which could include a centralized IT or IT security managed process for downloading, testing, and publishing updates out to users. Additionally, leveraging advanced endpoint security solutions such as an endpoint detection and response, EDR, to detect malicious behavior in the event that a tainted software package is downloaded and executed. And ensuring proper logging and monitoring is in place between the software, hardware, and the internet, for example, as well as implementing the software and hardware using network segmentation with minimal access to the internet. And finally, establishing some formal employee training programs and policies, really encouraging security best practices to include security audits of code and development. Mandiant has also published various information for defenders, many of which is around the information like Stephen talked about, such as the tactics, techniques, and procedures, the TTPs, deep dive analysis of the malware and signatures, as well as indicators of compromise for both APT29 and Sunburst. Mandiant and Google Cloud have made many of these various resources publicly available to help organizations better understand and mitigate supply chain threats. This concludes our presentation. Thank you very much for joining us today. Take care.